Welcome to Lore of the Rings, where we explore the secret paths of Middle-earth and share the stories Tolkien never told. Before we dive in, take a moment to tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from and whether this tale has found you by day or by night. There are places in Middle-earth where even memory fears to tread. Places where the very air reeks of ash and malice, where the ground trembles with the breath of ancient fires, and where shadows move with a purpose all their own. Mordor is such a place, a realm of desolation so absolute that it seems to exist outside the natural order, a wound upon the world that refuses to heal. The chronicles speak of great battles fought upon its borders, of sieges and sorrows, of the last alliance and the breaking of Sauron's physical form. Yet there are moments, fleeting and terrible, that slip through the cracks of recorded history. Moments that occurred in darkness, witnessed only by stone and flame and the all-seeing eye that burned atop Barad-dûr. This is the tale of one such moment, a meeting spoken of in whispers, hinted at in fragments, yet never fully illuminated in the pages of the Red Book or the annals of Gondor. A meeting between two beings bound by the One Ring, though in vastly different measures. On one side, the Dark Lord Sauron returned to terrible power, his will extending like grasping fingers across the length and breadth of Middle-earth. On the other, a wretched creature, once a hobbit, now barely recognizable as anything born of Ilúvatar's song, Gollum, the one who bore the ring longer than any other living soul. Picture, if you will, the landscape of Mordor in the waning years of the Third Age. Mount Doom rises like a broken tooth against a sky choked with volcanic ash. Rivers of molten rock carve glowing veins through the plateau of Gorgoroth. The air shimmers with heat even in the deepest night, and the stench of sulfur clings to everything. This is a land designed for one purpose only, to serve as the forge and fortress of the enemy. No grass grows here, no bird sings. Even the orcs that patrol its wastes do so with a kind of desperate, cringing obedience, knowing that the eye might fall upon them at any moment, stripping away pretense and laying bare their thoughts. Somewhere within this nightmare realm, in chambers carved from volcanic rock or hidden beneath layers of ash and stone, two voices met in conference. What was said between them? What bargains were struck? What threats uttered? What knowledge exchanged? The texts remain frustratingly silent on the particulars, yet the fact of the meeting itself casts a long shadow across subsequent events. For Gollum did not simply wander into Mordor by accident. He was drawn there, or perhaps driven, compelled by forces he could neither understand nor resist. And Sauron, whose attention was fixed upon the movements of armies and the machinations of the wise, nevertheless found time to concern himself with this pitiful creature. Why? What could the Dark Lord possibly want with such a broken, contemptible thing? The answer lies in the ring itself, that cursed band of gold that Sauron poured so much of his essence into, the better to dominate all other wills. Gollum had possessed it for centuries, far longer than Bilbo or Frodo would. He had been shaped by it, corrupted and transformed until he was more a manifestation of the ring's influence than a person in his own right. To Sauron, Gollum represented a living link to the ring's whereabouts, a thread that might be pulled to unravel the mystery of where his greatest weapon had gone. But knowledge flows both ways, even in Mordor. If Sauron learned from Gollum, then Gollum, whether he understood it or not, absorbed something of Sauron's will, his malice, his terrible purpose. The meeting was not merely an interrogation. It was a communion of sorts, a dark sacrament performed in the bowels of the Black Land, binding these two souls together in ways that would echo through the final days of the age. The great tapestries of history are woven from countless threads, some bright and others dark. We know of Frodo's courage and Sam's loyalty. We celebrate Aragorn's nobility and Gandalf's wisdom. But what of the shadows between the threads? What of the moments that occurred in darkness, unwitnessed and unrecorded, yet which shaped the pattern as surely as any heroic deed? This meeting is one such moment. It happened in secrecy, far from the eyes of the free peoples, yet its consequences rippled outward like circles in dark water, touching everything, changing everything. In the heart of Mordor, where light dares not linger, a voice whispered to another, a meeting unrecorded in any scroll or song. To speak of this meeting is to venture into the realm of educated speculation, drawing upon fragments scattered throughout Tolkien's vast legendarium. The professor himself was meticulous in his world building, yet even he acknowledged that not everything could be recorded. Some events occurred in darkness, known only to those who participated in them. Our task, then, is to gather what evidence exists and to weave it into a coherent narrative, always remaining faithful to the spirit and tone of Middle-earth. The primary sources are few but significant. In the appendices to The Lord of the Rings, we learn that Gollum was captured by Sauron's servants sometime around the year 3017 of the Third Age. He was taken to Barad-dûr and interrogated. The texts tell us this much plainly, though they do not elaborate on the nature or duration of his captivity. Gandalf himself references this event when speaking to Frodo in Bag End, explaining how Sauron learned the names Shire and Baggins from the wretched creature's lips. But was this interrogation conducted by Sauron himself, or merely by his servants? The texts leave this ambiguous, yet the implications are staggering. Sauron at this time was a being of immense power, his spirit housed within Barad-dûr, his consciousness extending throughout Mordor and beyond. He was not a figure who concerned himself with trivialities. If he chose to interrogate Gollum personally, if he turned the full force of his attention upon this miserable creature, then the meeting must have been of paramount importance. Consider also the nature of the ring. It was Sauron's creation, bound to him in ways that transcended physical possession. Even separated from it, he could sense its influence, feel its presence in the world like a distant heartbeat. Gollum had carried the ring for nearly 500 years, far longer than any mortal was meant to endure such a burden. In a very real sense, the ring had consumed him, hollowing him out and filling the empty spaces with obsession and madness. To interrogate Gollum was, in a way, to commune with the ring itself, to trace the pathways of its influence back through the centuries. Tolkien's letters provide additional context, though they too are frustratingly vague on the specifics. In one correspondence, he notes that Gollum's torture in Mordor was both physical and psychological, designed to break what little resistance remained in his fractured mind. Yet torture implies interrogators, and if the goal was to extract information about the ring, the most precious object in all of Middle-earth, would Sauron truly delegate that task to subordinates? Or would he claim this privilege for himself, drinking deep of the knowledge that only Gollum could provide? The manuscripts preserved in the archives at Marquette University contain drafts and revisions that shed additional light. In some versions, Gollum's time in Mordor is described in greater detail, with references to dark chambers beneath the fortress, to the sound of his screams echoing through stone corridors, to the moment when his will finally broke and he told his captors everything they wished to know. These passages were ultimately condensed in the published work, leaving only the bare facts, but they hint at a more extensive and terrible experience than the casual reader might suppose. Maps, too, tell their own story. The geography of Mordor is meticulously rendered in Tolkien's drawings. The winding path through Cirith Ungol, the placement of Barad-dûr relative to Mount Doom, the network of roads and fortifications that crisscrossed the plateau of Gorgoroth. Somewhere within this nightmarish landscape, in chambers designed for purposes we can barely imagine, the meeting took place. Perhaps in the dungeons of the Dark Tower itself, where the very stones were saturated with malice. Perhaps in some secret place, hidden even from the orcs and Nazgul, where Sauron could conduct his most delicate business without fear of interruption. What we know with certainty is this: Gollum entered Mordor as a prisoner and emerged forever changed. He had looked upon the eye. He had felt the weight of Sauron's will pressing down upon him like a physical force. And though he escaped, or was permitted to escape, for even this is unclear, he carried with him a burden greater than the ring itself. He carried knowledge of Sauron's mind, an understanding of the enemy's purpose that no other living creature could claim. This knowledge would guide his actions in the months to come, shaping his betrayals and his lies, leading ultimately to the slopes of Mount Doom and the moment when the ring was finally destroyed. The ink fades and the pages lie silent, yet the truth lingers in shadow, waiting to be uncovered. To understand the meeting between Gollum and Sauron, we must first understand Gollum himself, not merely the creature he had become, but the long and tragic road that led him to Mordor's gates. His story is one of the most complete chronicles of corruption in all of Tolkien's works, a case study in how the ring destroys those who possess it. He was born Sméagol, a store hobbit dwelling along the banks of the Gladden River in the early years of the Third Age. The texts describe him as belonging to a family of some standing, possessing the curiosity and cleverness typical of his kind. On his birthday, he went fishing with his cousin Déagol, and there, in the mud at the river's bottom, Déagol found something that gleamed gold in the sunlight. The ring had been waiting there since Isildur's death millennia before, biding its time, and now it had found a new bearer. What happened next is seared into the mythology of Middle-earth. Sméagol looked upon the ring and was immediately consumed by desire so powerful it obliterated reason, morality, kinship, everything that made him a person. He demanded the ring as a birthday gift. When Déagol refused, Sméagol strangled him with his bare hands, committing murder for the sake of a trinket he had laid eyes upon mere moments before. This was the ring's first gift to him, the capacity for ultimate betrayal. But murder was only the beginning. Sméagol took the ring and fled into darkness, both literal and metaphorical. His people cast him out when they discovered what he had done, and he retreated into the misty mountains, seeking caves and tunnels where sunlight could not reach. Over the centuries, for the ring extended his life far beyond its natural span, he descended into a state that can hardly be called living. His body twisted and contorted, becoming something amphibian, something that belonged to the dark places under the earth. His mind fractured, splitting into two personalities that argued with each other in whispered conversations. Sméagol, the fading remnant of who he had been, and Gollum, the creature born of the ring's corruption. He lost track of time in the dark. Years blurred into decades, decades into centuries. He forgot the taste of bread, the feel of sunshine, the sound of another voice speaking to him with kindness. His world narrowed to three things: the ring, which he called his precious, the fish he caught in his underground lake, and the riddles he spoke to himself in the endless dark. The ring sustained him physically, but destroyed him in every other way. It fed on his life force, drawing out his years like a spider draining its prey, giving him longevity, but at the cost of everything that made life worth living. Then came the unthinkable. Bilbo Baggins stumbled into his lair, and through a combination of chance, courage, and the ring's own inscrutable will, the hobbit from the Shire took the ring for himself. Gollum's howls of anguish echoed through the mountains as he realized what had been taken from him. For the first time in nearly 500 years, he was separated from the one thing that had defined his existence. The loss was total, absolute, unbearable. It would have been kinder if Bilbo had killed him, but Gollum did not die. Instead, he began to search, driven by an obsession that made his previous madness seem mild by comparison. He left the mountains and went hunting through Mirkwood and beyond, following rumors and whispers, always seeking news of the thief who had stolen his precious. His quest eventually led him into the hands of Aragorn, who captured him and delivered him to Thranduil's halls in Mirkwood. There he was held prisoner, though the elves treated him with more mercy than he deserved. It was from this captivity that he escaped, or possibly was released. The texts are unclear on this point. What matters is that he found himself once again pursuing the ring, and his pursuit led him ever eastward, toward the shadow growing in Mordor. Whether he went there deliberately or was drawn by forces he could not resist is a question that haunts the narrative. The ring called to him across the miles, singing in a frequency only he could hear. But the ring also called to Sauron, its creator, and Sauron's will was far stronger than any resistance Gollum might mount. Picture him, then, as he approached the borders of Mordor, a wretched figure crawling on all fours, his skin pale and clammy, his eyes luminous with a sickly light. He moved at night, avoiding roads and settlements, driven by an instinct that was part animal and part something darker. He knew where the ring had gone, southwest, toward the lands of the Shire, but he also knew that Mordor lay between him and his goal. Perhaps he meant only to skirt its borders, to avoid detection. Or perhaps some part of him, the part that the ring had hollowed out and claimed, understood that he must present himself before Sauron, must acknowledge the true master of the precious. In any case, the Dark Lord's servants found him. Orcs on patrol, perhaps, or one of the Nazgûl circling on their fell beasts. There would have been no escape, no possibility of resistance. Gollum was taken in chains to Barad-dûr, dragged through the Black Gate and across the plains of Gorgoroth, brought at last to the dungeons of the Dark Tower. And there, in chambers designed to break the will of far stronger beings than he, Gollum came face to face with the source of all his torment, the creator of the ring, the architect of his 500-year nightmare. Every step he took drew him closer to the shadow and to a presence that waited, unseen, yet all-knowing. To speak of Sauron is to speak of evil so profound that it has become abstracted, transformed from mere malice into something approaching a natural force. He was not born evil, few in Tolkien's universe are. Rather, he chose it, step by step, decision by decision, until there was nothing left of whatever he had been before. By the time of the Third Age, Sauron had ceased to be a person in any meaningful sense. He had become evil itself, embodied and terrible. His origins lie in the deeps of time, in the music of the Aenir that shaped the world. He was Mairon once, a Maya of Alla the Smith, drawn to order and craft and the imposition of will upon matter. Even his fall was gradual. First, he followed Morgoth, the original Dark Lord, believing that through tyranny and control, a better world could be forged. By the time he understood his error, if he ever did, it was far too late. The corruption had taken root, and he had become something that could not turn back. The First Age saw him as Morgoth's lieutenant, orchestrating campaigns of terror and subjugation. When Morgoth was cast into the void at the end of that age, Sauron survived, going into hiding but never truly repenting. The Second Age witnessed his return, this time not as a servant but as a master in his own right. He seduced the elven smiths of a region, teaching them secrets of craft and power, and together they forged the rings of power. But the greatest ring, the one that could rule all the others, he made in secret, pouring into it a vast portion of his own essence. This was both his triumph and his doom. The ring gave him power beyond measure, the ability to dominate wills, to see into the hearts of those who wore the other rings, to extend his consciousness across vast distances. But it also bound him to the ring in ways that could not be undone. If the ring were destroyed, so too would Sauron be diminished beyond recovery. This vulnerability should have made him cautious, but instead, it made him obsessive. The ring became not merely a tool but an extension of himself, and its loss was a wound that festered across millennia. After his first defeat at the hands of the Last Alliance, after Isildur cut the ring from his finger and his physical form was destroyed, Sauron retreated into shadow. For centuries, he existed as little more than a malevolent will, slowly reconstituting himself in the fortress of Dol Guldur. By the time Gandalf confirmed his identity, he had grown strong enough to abandon even the pretense of hiding. He returned openly to Mordor, rebuilt Barad-dûr, and began gathering his armies for a final confrontation with the West. But always, his thoughts returned to the ring. Where was it? Who possessed it? The question gnawed at him, for without the ring, his power, though vast, was incomplete. He could sense it distantly, a presence in the world that resonated with his own diminished spirit. He knew it had not been destroyed. The world itself would have shuddered if that had occurred. So it remained somewhere, hidden or lost, and he devoted enormous resources to discovering its whereabouts. His agents spread across Middle-earth. The Nazgul, his most terrible servants, were dispatched to scour the lands between the misty mountains and the sea. Spies and informants were cultivated in every realm. Even Saruman, nominally an ally of the West, was corrupted and turned to Sauron's service, tasked with searching the Gladden fields where the ring had been lost. The Dark Lord's web of surveillance grew ever more comprehensive, and at its center sat Sauron himself, housed in Barad-dûr, his consciousness radiating outward like spokes from a wheel. The Eye of Sauron was no mere metaphor. Those who looked upon it described a literal eye, wreathed in flame, lidless and terrible, that could pierce through stone and shadow to lay bare the secrets of the heart. It turned ceaselessly, scanning the horizons, searching, always searching. To fall under that gaze was to experience terror in its purest form, a sense of being utterly known and utterly insignificant simultaneously. Strong men went mad from a single glimpse. Weak men simply collapsed, their wills shattered like glass. Yet for all his power, Sauron was not omniscient. He could not see everything, could not be everywhere at once. This limitation frustrated him and made him paranoid. He suspected plots where none existed and overlooked genuine threats because they seemed too small to merit attention. The hobbits, for instance, what were they to him? a race so diminutive and insignificant that they barely registered in his strategic calculations. Even when he learned the name Shire from Gollum, he did not truly understand what it meant. He could not conceive that such small creatures might pose a danger to one as mighty as himself. This was Sauron's great blindness, the flaw in his otherwise formidable intellect. He understood power and domination, but he could not comprehend sacrifice, friendship, or the quiet courage of ordinary beings. These were weaknesses in his eyes, things to be exploited or destroyed. The idea that weakness might also be a kind of strength, that humility might succeed where pride failed, was utterly foreign to him. And this blindness would ultimately prove his undoing. But in the year 3017, with Gollum brought in chains before him, Sauron had reason to believe he was close to achieving his goal. Here at last was someone who had possessed the ring, who could tell him where it had gone and into whose hands it had passed. The interrogation would not be gentle. Sauron had no capacity for mercy, no inclination to spare his prisoner unnecessary suffering. But he was patient when patience served his purposes. He would extract every scrap of knowledge from Gollum's broken mind, and then he would act. The Dark Lord knew the ring's whispers, and he knew the creature that carried it. Yet what was spoken between them is lost to shadow. Imagine, if you can, the horror of being Gollum as he was dragged toward Barad-dûr. Every instinct screamed at him to flee, to burrow into the earth and hide, but there was no escape. The chains that bound him were not merely physical. They were extensions of Sauron's will, invisible cords that wrapped around his mind and compelled obedience. He had spent centuries in darkness, master of his subterranean domain, and now he was utterly helpless, a prisoner being brought before a power that made his worst nightmares seem like pleasant dreams. The journey across Mordor would have taken days, perhaps weeks. The landscape itself seemed designed to inflict maximum psychological torment. The ground was cracked and broken, radiating heat even through the soles of his feet. Rivers of lava carved glowing channels through the rock, their light casting flickering shadows that danced like demons. The sky was perpetually choked with ash, a gray-black shroud that blocked out sun and stars alike. At night, if night can be said to exist in such a place, the darkness was absolute, broken only by the distant glow of Mount Doom and the occasional torch carried by orc patrols. Those patrols were everywhere, evidence of Sauron's iron control over his domain. Orcs moved in disciplined units, their armor clanking, their guttural voices barking orders in the black speech. They watched everything with suspicious yellow eyes, ready to report any anomaly to their superiors. Trolls hauled siege engines along the roads, massive constructs of wood and iron designed to break the walls of Minas Tirith. Fell beasts circled overhead, their riders scanning the ground for signs of intrusion. Mordor was not merely a fortress. It was a vast military machine, every component perfectly synchronized, all of it directed by the will of a single malevolent intelligence. Gollum would have been acutely aware of his own insignificance in this place. He was accustomed to being the most dangerous thing in his environment, the predator rather than the prey. But here he was nothing, less than nothing. The orcs regarded him with casual cruelty, kicking him when he stumbled, dragging him forward when he tried to rest. To them, he was cargo, a package to be delivered to the Dark Tower and nothing more. His protests, his pleas, his desperate bargaining fell on ears that had long since ceased to care about suffering. As they drew nearer to Barad-dûr, the oppression intensified. The Dark Tower was visible from 100 miles away, a black spike stabbing upward into the poisoned sky. It dwarfed the mountains around it, a monument to Sauron's pride and power. The closer they came, the more Gollum could feel it, a psychic weight pressing down on him, making it difficult to breathe, to think, to be. This was the heart of Sauron's realm, the place where his consciousness was most concentrated, and every stone of the tower radiated malice. The gates of Barad-dûr were immense, forged from black iron and carved with glyphs in the Black Speech. They swung open at the approach of the orcs, revealing courtyards filled with soldiers and slaves, with forges and armories, with all the apparatus of war. Gollum was dragged through this nightmare landscape, past scenes of torture and degradation that would haunt him for whatever remained of his wretched life. Orcs fought each other for scraps of food. Slaves were whipped for minor infractions. Prisoners hung in gibbets, dying slowly under the pitiless sky. And then, at last, he was brought downward, into the dungeons that honeycombed the foundations of the tower. These were chambers that had witnessed suffering beyond description, rooms where the very walls seemed to absorb screams and store them for later echoing. The air was thick with moisture and mold, and things moved in the shadows that Gollum dared not look at directly. His captors thrust him into a cell and left him there, alone with his terror. How long did he wait? Hours, days. Time had no meaning in that place. The darkness was absolute, and the silence was broken only by distant screams and the drip of water. Gollum huddled in the corner, his mind fragmenting further under the strain. Sméagol whimpered and pleaded, begging the precious to save him. Gollum snarled and plotted, already thinking of escape, of revenge, of the moment when he might reclaim what had been stolen. But beneath both personalities was a deeper layer of consciousness, a place where pure animal terror resided. He knew, with the certainty of instinct, that something terrible was coming for him. When they finally came to fetch him, he could not even scream. His voice had abandoned him, fled along with his courage. He was dragged from the cell and marched through corridors lit by guttering torches. The architecture around him was inhuman, designed according to principles of malice and domination. The ceilings were too high, the doorways too narrow, the angles all wrong in ways that made the eye hurt to perceive them. This was Sauron's aesthetic made manifest. Beauty perverted, craft turned to the service of oppression. And then he was brought into a chamber that defied description. It might have been a throne room, or an interrogation cell, or something that served both purposes. The walls were carved from volcanic rock, shot through with veins of some phosphorescent mineral that pulsed like living tissue. The floor was polished to mirror smoothness, reflecting distorted images of everyone who walked upon it. At the far end of the chamber, a presence waited, not a physical form, but a concentration of will so intense that it seemed to warp the very air. The eye was there, in the chamber or perhaps behind it, looking through into the world. Gollum could feel it turning toward him, focusing, and in that moment he understood the true meaning of helplessness. He had nowhere to hide, no secrets that could be kept. His mind was laid open like a book, every memory, every thought, every shameful deed exposed to scrutiny. And the intelligence examining him was not merely powerful. It was ancient, cold, utterly without mercy. He crept where no light touched, and yet he felt eyes that saw all, waiting in the void between fear and fate. The chamber itself seemed alive, breathing in rhythm with Gollum's racing heart. Phosphorescent veins in the rock pulsed with a sickly green light, casting shadows that moved independently of any visible source. The air was thick with heat and sulfur, each breath burning in the lungs like inhaled fire. This was a place designed for a single purpose: to break the will of anyone unfortunate enough to be brought here. And Gollum, already broken in so many ways, found himself shattered anew by the sheer malevolence of the space. There was no throne, no physical manifestation of Sauron to which Gollum might direct his pleas. Instead, there was only presence, a consciousness so vast and terrible that it filled the chamber the way water fills a vessel. Gollum could feel it pressing against his mind, probing, questioning, dissecting his thoughts with surgical precision. The experience was similar to what he had felt when the ring spoke to him, but magnified 1,000-fold. The ring had been seductive, whispering promises and possibilities. This was nothing but command, irresistible and absolute. "You have possessed my creation," came the voice, though whether Gollum heard it with his ears or directly in his mind was impossible to say. It was a voice of iron and ash, beautiful in its terrible majesty, utterly devoid of anything resembling compassion. "For centuries you carried it, corrupted by it, sustained by it. You are bound to it still. I can feel the resonance in your very essence. Tell me, where is it now?" Gollum writhed on the floor, his body contorting as he fought against the compulsion to answer. Some small part of him, the last defiant remnant of Smeagol, tried to resist. The precious was his alone, and he would not betray it to anyone, not even to its maker. But resistance was futile. Sauron's will closed around his mind like a fist, squeezing, crushing, until there was no room left for anything but obedience. "Baggins," Gollum whimpered, the name torn from his throat. "Baggins took it from us. Thief, trickster, nasty Baggins stole our precious." The presence shifted, focusing more intently. Gollum felt his memories being rifled through like pages in a book, his encounter with Bilbo replayed in excruciating detail. He saw it again through Sauron's perspective. The riddle game, the moment of realization when the ring became invisible, the chase through the dark tunnels. But Sauron was not interested in the past for its own sake. He wanted current information, actionable intelligence. "Where is this Baggins now?" The question was not asked, but rather impressed directly upon Gollum's consciousness, bypassing language entirely. "Shire," Gollum gasped. "In the Shire where the little people live. Baggins, Baggins." More pressure, more probing. Sauron wanted details, geography, routes, defenses. Gollum knew little of such matters, but what he knew was extracted with ruthless efficiency. The Shire was in the northwest, a land of rolling hills and comfortable burrows, populated by a race so insignificant that they barely registered in the chronicles of Middle-earth. Baggins lived in a place called Bag End, in a village called Hobbiton. These names meant nothing to Sauron initially, but he stored them away, pieces of a puzzle he was assembling. But there was something else, something that Gollum could not quite articulate even under torture. The ring had not merely sustained him. It had shown him things, whispered secrets, revealed glimpses of patterns and possibilities that his waking mind could not comprehend. Deep in his subconscious, buried beneath layers of madness and obsession, was knowledge that even he did not know he possessed. And Sauron, patient and thorough, began to excavate that knowledge like an archaeologist brushing away dirt from ancient bones. He learned of Gollum's escape from the elves, of his wanderings through Mirkwood and beyond. He learned of the creature's obsessive search for the ring, the single-minded devotion that had sustained him through years of hardship. Most importantly, he learned that the ring was no longer in Bilbo's possession, that it had passed to another, a nephew perhaps, or some relation. The details were hazy even in Gollum's mind, but the essential fact was clear. The ring was still in the Shire, or at least it had been when last Gollum had been able to sense it. This information was valuable, but it was not complete. Sauron needed more. He needed to know if the bearers understood what they possessed. He needed to know if the wise had become involved. Most of all, he needed to know if his enemies had discovered his one great vulnerability, that the ring, if destroyed, would unmake him forever. The interrogation stretched on, minutes becoming hours, becoming something that transcended normal time. Gollum's consciousness fragmented under the assault, splitting into ever smaller pieces as Sauron's will hammered against it. He babbled and screamed, offering up every memory, every secret, every shameful thought in a desperate attempt to make the pain stop. But pain was not the primary tool here. Sauron used fear, despair, the terrible knowledge that there was no escape, no mercy, no hope of release. And yet, beneath the horror of the interrogation, something else was happening. Gollum was not merely a victim being drained of information. He was also, in a strange and terrible way, being marked. Sauron's attention was a brand that seared itself into his soul, leaving traces that would never fully fade. The Dark Lord's voice echoed in chambers of Gollum's mind that had never before held another's words. Commands were implanted, subtle and insidious, instructions that would activate when certain conditions were met. Release the creature, Sauron had decided. Let him escape or believe he had escaped and follow where he led. Gollum was bound to the ring in ways that even other servants could not match. His obsession would draw him back toward it, inevitably, irresistibly. And when he found it again, when he came into proximity with the current bearer, Sauron would be watching through eyes that Gollum did not know he possessed. This was the true genius of the interrogation. It was not merely extraction, but infiltration. Gollum had become a living surveillance device, a beacon that would guide Sauron's forces to their target. And the creature himself would never fully understand what had been done to him, would never realize that his own desperate quest to reclaim the precious was serving the purposes of the very power he most feared. And in the shadowed chamber, words unspoken weighed heavier than the mountains themselves. To be interrogated by Sauron was to experience a fundamental violation of the self. It was not merely that he could extract information. Any skilled torturer could do that, given time and sufficient cruelty. What made Sauron's methods so devastating was that he did not stop at information. He rewrote the very architecture of consciousness, inserting new imperatives and restructuring priorities in ways that seemed natural to the victim. By the time he was finished, his subjects believed that their own thoughts were their own, never suspecting that they had been subtly reprogrammed. Gollum was particularly vulnerable to this kind of manipulation. His mind had already been fractured by the ring, split into competing personalities that argued and schemed against each other. Into this chaos, Sauron introduced a third voice, not distinct enough to be recognized as foreign, but persistent enough to guide behavior. It whispered in moments of decision, nudging Gollum toward choices that served Sauron's purposes. It fed his paranoia and his obsession, ensuring that he would never rest, never stop searching for the ring. But there was more to the interrogation than mere mental manipulation. There was also a philosophical dimension, a dark communion between two beings who had both been utterly consumed by the ring's influence. In a sense, They were kindred spirits, though separated by vast gulfs of power and purpose. Both had sacrificed everything for the sake of the ring, Sauron by pouring his essence into it, Gollum by allowing it to devour his life and identity. Both were diminished by its loss, incomplete without it. Did Sauron recognize this kinship? Perhaps. His attention to Gollum was too intense, too personal, to be explained purely by strategic considerations. He could have delegated the interrogation to the Nazgul or to some other servant. Instead, he chose to involve himself directly, to turn the full force of his consciousness upon this wretched creature. Why? Maybe because Gollum represented something Sauron feared becoming, a being utterly dependent on the ring, incapable of existing without it. Or maybe because he saw in Gollum a reflection of his own obsession, magnified and distorted. Whatever the reason, the meeting transformed both participants. Gollum emerged from it forever marked, carrying within him traces of Sauron's will that would influence his actions for the remainder of his life. But Sauron, too, was affected, though in more subtle ways. He had gained valuable intelligence about the ring's whereabouts, yes, but he had also been reminded of the ring's power to corrupt and control. Every moment that it remained beyond his grasp was a moment of vulnerability, a wound that would not heal. The psychological interplay between interrogator and subject was complex, layered with meaning that neither fully understood. Sauron saw Gollum as a tool, a means to an end, expendable and contemptible. Yet he also saw him as a warning, a demonstration of what the ring could do to those who possessed it for too long. Gollum, for his part, experienced Sauron as pure terror, a force of nature that could not be resisted or reasoned with. But on some deeper level, he also recognized Sauron as the ring's true master, the one being in all of Middle-earth who understood the precious as completely as he did. This recognition created a perverse bond between them. Gollum hated Sauron, feared him, would have fled to the ends of the earth to escape his attention. Yet he also felt a kind of reverence, an acknowledgement that here at last was someone who truly comprehended what the ring meant, what it was capable of. In the depths of his madness, Gollum almost welcomed the interrogation because it connected him, however painfully, to the precious he had lost. The strategic implications of the meeting were enormous. Sauron now knew that the ring was in the Shire, a place so remote and insignificant that he had barely heard of it. He knew the name, Baggins, though not which Baggins currently held the ring or whether they understood its nature. Most importantly, he knew that the ring had not been destroyed, that it still existed somewhere in Middle-earth, waiting to be reclaimed. Armed with this knowledge, he immediately dispatched agents. The Nazgul were sent forth to search for the Shire, to locate Baggins, to retrieve the ring by any means necessary. Saruman was contacted and instructed to intensify his own search efforts. Spies were activated throughout Eriador, instructed to watch for travelers and to report anything unusual. The machinery of Mordor shifted into high gear, all of it directed toward a single goal. Finding the ring before the enemy's enemies could mount any kind of defense. But Sauron made a crucial error, one born of his fundamental inability to understand certain types of people. He assumed that whoever possessed the ring would either use it or attempt to keep it safe. The idea that someone might choose to destroy it, to willingly throw away such power, was literally inconceivable to him. His entire worldview was built on the pursuit and maintenance of power. Sacrifice, self-denial, the rejection of dominion, these were weaknesses, aberrations, things that no rational being would choose. This blindness would cost him everything. While he searched for the ring intending to reclaim it, Frodo and the Fellowship were embarked on a quest to destroy it. While his armies massed for a conventional war of conquest, his true enemies were walking through his own lands, heading toward Mount Doom with the one weapon that could unmake him. And Gollum, the creature he had interrogated and released, would play a pivotal role in ensuring that outcome, though not in any way that Sauron could have predicted. The meeting in Mordor was thus a turning point disguised as an intelligence-gathering exercise. Sauron believed he had gained an advantage, that he had extracted valuable information and planted a useful spy. In reality, he had set in motion a chain of events that would lead to his own destruction. Gollum would find the ring again, yes, but not to deliver it to Mordor. Instead, he would carry it, or more accurately, would be carried by his obsession, to the very place where it could be unmade. In this sense, the meeting was a tragedy on multiple levels. It was tragic for Gollum, who suffered agonies beyond description. It was tragic for Sauron, who sowed the seeds of his own defeat. And it was tragic for Middle-earth as a whole, because the meeting ensured that the final confrontation would be even more terrible and unpredictable than it might otherwise have been. Two beings bound by the ring, manipulating and counter-manipulating each other, neither fully in control, both dancing to music they barely understood. A single slip, a whispered promise, and the scales of destiny trembled, unseen, yet irreversible. The meeting between Sauron and Gollum did not occur in isolation. Its reverberations spread outward, subtle but profound, influencing events across the breadth of Middle-earth. To understand its full significance, we must step back and examine the broader context. The movements of armies, the counsels of the wise, the quiet preparations being made in places as far-flung as Rivendell and the Shire. The year 3017 of the Third Age was a time of growing tension. Sauron had declared himself openly, abandoning the pretense of being merely the necromancer of Dol Guldur. His armies were gathering in Mordor, drilling and preparing for the war that everyone knew was coming. In the north, the kingdoms of men struggled to maintain their defenses against increasing orc raids. In the south, Gondor watched anxiously as Mordor's influence spread through Harad and Umbar, turning potential allies into enemies. The wise were troubled, though they did not yet understand the full extent of the danger. Gandalf suspected that Sauron was searching for something, some lost object of power, but he did not yet know what it was. Saruman, who should have been coordinating the defense of the West, was instead pursuing his own research into the ring, gradually succumbing to the same lust for power that had consumed so many before him. The elves prepared for departure, sensing that their time in Middle-earth was drawing to a close, that the coming war would mark the end of an age. Into this tense situation came the intelligence Sauron had extracted from Gollum. The Dark Lord now knew where to direct his search, what names to pursue, what region to focus his attention upon. Within weeks of Gollum's interrogation, the Nazgul were dispatched from Mordor, riding north and west on their fell beasts, terrifying all who saw them. They asked questions in villages and towns, seeking news of Baggins and Shire, leaving a trail of fear in their wake. This activity did not go unnoticed. Gandalf, traveling through the western lands, began to hear reports of black riders asking after the Shire. The pieces of a puzzle he had been unconsciously assembling suddenly clicked into place. The ring, Bilbo's magic ring, was not merely a curiosity or a helpful tool. It was the one ring, the ring of power that Isildur had taken from Sauron's hand. And now Sauron knew, or strongly suspected, where it was. The wizard's ride to the Shire, his urgent conference with Frodo, the hasty departure of the hobbits, all of these stemmed directly from the intelligence Sauron had gathered during his interrogation of Gollum. Without that meeting, the Dark Lord might have continued searching in vain for decades. The ring might have remained hidden in Bag End, its nature unknown, until some future crisis forced its revelation. Instead, the meeting compressed the timeline, forcing events into motion with a speed that none of the participants were fully prepared for. But the meeting's influence extended beyond mere logistics and timing. It also shaped the psychological landscape of the War of the Ring. Gollum's release from Mordor was intentional. Sauron wanted him free to pursue the ring, knowing that his obsession would eventually lead him to it. But this decision was based on a fundamental miscalculation. Sauron assumed that Gollum would serve his purposes, that the creature's predictability could be exploited. He did not account for the possibility that Gollum might serve other purposes entirely, that his obsession might lead to outcomes that no one, not even Gollum himself, could predict. When Gollum finally encountered Frodo and Sam in Emin Muil, he was driven by multiple imperatives. His own desperate desire to reclaim the precious was paramount, of course, but beneath that was the subtler influence of Sauron's manipulation, the commands that had been implanted during the interrogation. These competing drives created a paralysis of will, a state where Gollum could not fully commit to any single course of action. He helped the hobbits because he needed them to lead him to the ring. He betrayed them because betrayal was his nature. He led them into danger and then inexplicably saved them from it. This unpredictability was precisely what Sauron's strategies could not account for. The Dark Lord's plans were built on control, on the careful manipulation of pieces on a vast chessboard. But Gollum was a piece that refused to move in predictable ways. He was too broken, too consumed by conflicting obsessions, to serve anyone's purposes reliably, even his own. And this chaos, this inability to be controlled, ultimately served the cause of the ring's destruction far better than any conscious strategy could have. Consider the chain of causation. Sauron interrogated Gollum to learn the ring's location. This led to the Nazgul's search, which forced Frodo to flee the Shire. Gandalf's recognition of the danger led to the Council of Elrond and the formation of the Fellowship. Gollum's obsessive pursuit of Frodo brought him to Moria, and then to Lothlorien and beyond, shadowing the Fellowship's journey. His eventual capture by Frodo created an opportunity for manipulation, but also for mercy. Frodo's decision not to kill him, influenced by Gandalf's earlier words about pity and the importance of Gollum's role in fate. Every link in this chain traced back, directly or indirectly, to the meeting in Mordor. Sauron had initiated a sequence of events that he believed would lead to the ring's recovery. Instead, it led to his own destruction because the sequence was too complex, too dependent on the choices of beings he could not fully control to serve his purposes reliably. The irony is profound. The Dark Lord, master of manipulation, architect of countless stratagems, destroyed himself by being too clever. If he had never interrogated Gollum, if he had simply killed the creature or left him to rot in the dungeons of Barad-dûr, the timeline would have unfolded very differently. The Nazgul might not have found the Shire so quickly. Frodo might have had more time to prepare, or conversely, might never have known what he possessed until it was too late. The variables are endless, but the essential point remains. By acting on the intelligence he gained from Gollum, Sauron accelerated his own demise. And though the world marched unaware, threads unseen wove the fates of kings, heroes, and the wretched alike. The philosophical heart of the matter lies in a question that Tolkien returns to again and again throughout his work: the nature of fate versus free will. Was Gollum's meeting with Sauron predestined, a necessary step in the chain of events that would lead to the ring's destruction? Or was it simply one of countless contingent moments, important because of how it happened to play out, but not cosmically mandated? Tolkien's universe operates according to principles that blend these two perspectives. There is Eru Ilúvatar, the supreme creator, whose music shaped the world and whose providence guides events at the highest level. But there is also genuine freedom, the capacity of individual beings to make real choices that matter, that shape outcomes. The tension between these two forces creates a narrative space where characters struggle with the weight of their decisions, never quite certain whether they are choosing freely or fulfilling a destiny that was written before they were born. Gollum embodies this tension more than almost any other character. His damnation began with a choice: the decision to murder Déagol for the ring. That single act of freely chosen evil set him on a path that would consume 500 years of life and transform him into something barely recognizable as a person. Yet once he possessed the ring, was he still choosing freely? Or had he become a mechanism, a piece of clockwork wound up and set in motion by forces far greater than himself? The text suggests both possibilities simultaneously. Gandalf tells Frodo that Gollum was meant to find the ring, that Bilbo was meant to have it, and that even Frodo's inheritance of it was part of some larger design. This implies providence, a guiding hand that arranges events toward a particular end. Yet the same text emphasizes the importance of choices made in the moment. Frodo's decision to spare Gollum's life, Sam's loyalty, Gollum's own final desperate lunge for the ring that sends both ring and bearer tumbling into the fires of Mount Doom. The meeting between Sauron and Gollum sits at this intersection of fate and choice. From one perspective, it was inevitable. Gollum was drawn to Mordor by forces he could not resist, and Sauron's interrogation was simply the logical outcome of that compulsion. The information extracted, the manipulations implanted, the release of Gollum to serve as an unwitting agent, all of this followed necessarily from the premises established by the ring's nature and the characters involved. From another perspective, nothing was inevitable. Gollum might have died in Mirkwood, killed by orcs or taken by some other danger. He might have been executed by the elves rather than held prisoner. He might have never escaped from Thranduil's halls, in which case he would never have been captured by Sauron's forces. Even assuming his capture, Sauron might have handled the interrogation differently. He might have killed Gollum outright, or kept him imprisoned, or sent him on a different mission entirely. What makes the meeting so fascinating is that it seems to be both necessary and contingent, both fated and freely chosen. The characters involved were acting according to their natures, Gollum seeking the ring, Sauron seeking knowledge, yet the specific form their interaction took, the precise words spoken and commands given, these were unique to the moment. Change any detail, and the outcome might have been entirely different. This ambiguity extends to the moral dimensions of the meeting as well. Gollum was tortured, violated, used as a tool. From one angle, this is pure evil, the strong victimizing the weak for selfish purposes. Yet the same events ultimately served the cause of the ring's destruction, which was unambiguously good. Does this mean that Sauron's evil actions accidentally produced good results? Or does it suggest that some providential force was working through even the darkest moments, ensuring that all things, even evil itself, would ultimately serve the purposes of good? Tolkien does not provide easy answers to these questions, and perhaps that is the point. The meeting between Sauron and Gollum is morally complex, philosophically challenging, resistant to simple categorization. It forces us to sit with the uncomfortable reality that good and evil are often intertwined in ways that defy neat separation, that the same event can be both terrible and necessary, both damning and redemptive. Consider the cascade of consequences that flowed from the meeting. Gollum suffered horribly, his mind further broken by the interrogation. This is straightforwardly bad, yet his suffering also motivated his later actions, including his guidance of Frodo and Sam through Mordor and his final role in destroying the ring. Would he have played that role if not for the meeting with Sauron? Would he have been capable of navigating Mordor's dangers, of knowing the paths and passwords, if he had not been dragged through them as a prisoner? Similarly, Sauron gained intelligence that he believed would help him reclaim the ring, yet that same intelligence set in motion events that led to his destruction. He acted with malice, intending evil, yet the outcome of his actions was his own defeat. Is this justice, providence, mere chance? The text allows for all of these interpretations simultaneously, refusing to collapse into a single, definitive reading. What remains, beneath all the philosophical complexity, is the human, or hobbit, level experience of the participants. Gollum suffered. That suffering was real, immediate, overwhelming. Whatever cosmic purposes it might have served, whatever role it played in the larger tapestry of fate, it was primarily an experience of agony endured by a conscious being. To focus solely on the outcomes, to justify the means by the ends, is to miss something essential about Tolkien's moral vision. He believed in providence, yes, but he also believed in the sanctity of individual experience, the weight of suffering, the importance of mercy even toward those who might seem to deserve only condemnation. The meeting between Sauron and Gollum was necessary, perhaps, but that necessity does not make it any less tragic. Two beings, both corrupted by the ring in different ways, met in a chamber beneath Mordor, and what transpired there sent ripples through time that would shape the fate of an entire world. Every tremor of shadow, every echo of fear, whispered of a destiny neither fully chosen nor entirely imposed. As our tale draws toward its close, we must step back and view the meeting between Sauron and Gollum not as an isolated incident, but as a thread woven into the larger tapestry of Middle-earth's history. Every story Tolkien told was part of a greater story, a pattern of rising and falling, of light struggling against darkness, of ages beginning and ending in fire and sorrow and ultimately renewal. The Third Age was drawing toward its conclusion, though few who lived through its final years could have known it at the time. It was an age marked by the fading of the elves, the diminishment of the great powers that had shaped the Second Age, and the gradual ascendance of men to their role as the inheritors of Middle-earth. Into this transitional period came the crisis of the ring, a test that would determine not merely the fate of kingdoms, but the very nature of the age to come. The meeting in Mordor was part of that test, a moment when the forces of domination and corruption came closest to achieving their ultimate goal. If Sauron had succeeded in reclaiming the ring, the consequences would have been catastrophic and permanent. He would have become unchallengeable, a dark lord whose power extended across all of Middle-earth and perhaps beyond. The free peoples would have been enslaved or destroyed. The very concept of resistance would have been erased from memory, and a new age, an age of eternal shadow, would have begun. That this did not happen, that the ring was ultimately destroyed and Sauron diminished beyond any possibility of return, was due to countless factors. The courage of hobbits, the wisdom of wizards, the strength of men, and the grace of elves all played their part. But among these factors, often overlooked in the grand narratives, was the role of Gollum. The creature was damned, yes, utterly corrupted by the ring and incapable of redemption in any conventional sense. Yet his very corruption, his obsessive fixation on the precious, made him uniquely suited to play a crucial role in its destruction. The meeting with Sauron intensified this corruption, while simultaneously setting Gollum on a collision course with destiny. The Dark Lord meant to use him as a tool, a bloodhound that would sniff out the ring's location and lead his servants to it. Instead, Gollum became something more complex, a free agent of chaos, driven by impulses that even Sauron could not fully control or predict. His journey from Mordor to the Shire, from the Shire to Moria, from Moria to the Black Gate, and ultimately back into Mordor at Mount Doom, traced a pattern that made sense only in retrospect. And what was that pattern? It was the shape of tragic necessity, the form that destiny takes when working through broken instruments. Gollum could not be redeemed, but he could be used. He could not overcome his nature, but his nature could be bent, by providence or chance or some combination of both, toward a purpose greater than himself. In the end, it was Gollum who destroyed the ring, not through any deliberate choice, but through the inevitable culmination of his obsession. He seized the ring from Frodo at the very brink of Mount Doom, and in his moment of triumph, lost his footing and plunged into the fires below. Could this ending have occurred without the meeting in Mordor? Perhaps, but it would have been different, and the differences might have been decisive. Gollum's knowledge of Mordor's geography, gained during his captivity, allowed him to guide Frodo and Sam through regions they could never have navigated alone. His understanding of orc passwords and patrol patterns, absorbed during his time as a prisoner, kept them alive when any other path would have led to capture. Even his twisted psychology, further warped by Sauron's interrogation, made him susceptible to Frodo's mercy in ways that a purely evil creature might not have been. The meeting, then, was a pivot point, a moment when multiple possible futures hung in balance and one particular future was selected, not through any single choice, but through the accumulation of countless small factors. Sauron believed he was orchestrating events, pulling strings to ensure his victory. In reality, he was participating in a drama whose script was written at a level far above his comprehension. The same could be said of Gollum, who thought only of the precious and had no conception of the vast forces that his actions would ultimately serve. This is the deepest irony of the War of the Ring. The greatest powers were often the least effective. Sauron, with all his might and malice, could not reclaim the ring. Saruman, with all his cunning and knowledge, was reduced to a petty tyrant ruling over a ruined land. The Nazgul, terror incarnate, were held at bay by a simple hobbit bearing nothing but a small sword and a friend's love. Meanwhile, the smallest and least regarded beings, hobbits from the Shire, a miserable creature dwelling in caves, were the ones who changed everything. There is a moral here, one that Tolkien returns to throughout his work. Power in his universe is ultimately self-limiting. The pursuit of domination leads inevitably to blindness, to an inability to see threats that do not manifest as armies or sorcery. Sauron could not conceive that anyone would choose to destroy the ring rather than use it, and this blindness was more damaging to him than any military defeat. Humility, by contrast, opens possibilities that pride can never access. Frodo succeeded not because he was mighty, but because he was willing to bear a burden that no mighty being could have carried. Sam persevered not through strength of arms, but through loyalty and love. And Gollum, what does his role tell us? Perhaps this, that even the most corrupted, the most broken, the most seemingly irredeemable beings can serve purposes beyond themselves. Not through any merit of their own, not through choices freely made toward good, but simply by being what they are and doing what they must. Gollum's damnation was real and terrible, and nothing in the story redeems it. Yet his damnation also became, in ways he could never understand, an instrument of salvation for others. The meeting in Mordor stands as a testament to the complexity of Tolkien's vision. It was not a simple confrontation between hero and villain, not a straightforward exchange of information. It was a nexus point where multiple themes converged. The nature of evil and corruption, the relationship between fate and free will, the question of whether suffering can ever be justified by its outcomes. These themes do not resolve into neat conclusions. They remain in tension, pulling against each other, creating the kind of moral complexity that makes Tolkien's work endure long after simpler fantasies have been forgotten. As we stand now, looking back across the years and the pages, we can see the full pattern. We know that the meeting led to Gollum's release, which led to his pursuit of Frodo, which led to his guidance through Mordor, which led ultimately to the ring's destruction. But this knowledge comes only in retrospect. To those living through the events, there was only darkness and uncertainty, only choices made with incomplete information, only faith that somehow, despite all evidence to the contrary, things might yet turn out for the best. The ash fields of Mordor lie quiet now, the fires of Mount Doom long since cooled. The Dark Tower has fallen, and grass grows where orcs once marched. The Third Age has ended, and the Fourth Age of men has begun. But the echoes of that secret meeting remain, whispered in the songs of the elves and the histories of the wise. Two voices met in darkness, and from their meeting came consequences that shaped the world. And so the secret endures, whispered to those who dare peer into shadow, a meeting that shaped worlds, yet remains forever unseen. Dear listener, this story ends, but many await. Subscribe so no tale escapes you.